The dust hadn't settled on the road for 3 days. That alone should have told Earl Hadley something was wrong. Out in Harlan County, Kansas, where the land stretches flat and merciless in every direction, where the horizon seems to pull away from you the harder you walk toward it, dust on the road meant movement. And movement in late August, when the heat pressed down like a boot on the back of your neck, meant somebody was either running towards something or running away from it. Earl was on his porch when he saw her. He'd been sitting in the same cracked wooden chair he'd sat in every evening for 11 years, since Margaret left and took the sound of laughter with her. He was holding a glass of well water that had gone warm before he could finish it. The cicadas were going loud in the sorghum fields. The sky was the color of dying coal, orange and purple, and the kind of red that makes old farmers think of fire. He almost didn't look up. That was the thing that stayed with him later. He almost didn't look up. But something, a sound that didn't belong to the evening, a pitch too sharp for the wind, made him lift his eyes toward the county road that cut through the edge of his property. A thin ribbon of packed dirt bordered by rusted fence posts and a line of cottonwood trees bent permanently sideways by years of Kansas wind. What he saw made him set down his glass. A girl, young, couldn't have been more than 19. She was wearing a plain cotton dress the color of old cream, and her dark hair had broken loose from whatever had been holding it. She wasn't walking. She was being dragged. The man pulling her was big, wide through the shoulders, moving with a kind of mechanical indifference that is more frightening than anger. He had her by the wrist. She was half stumbling, half resisting, her bare feet raising small puffs of dust with each desperate step. She wasn't screaming. That's what struck Earl most deeply. She wasn't screaming. She was enduring. Head down, jaw set, eyes on the ground as if she had already decided the ground was the only thing she could trust. Earl stood up slowly. His knees ached. His back ached. Most things about him ached these days. But his eyes were steady, and what they were seeing did not sit right with anything his mother had ever taught him, or his father, or the land itself, which had its own quiet morality, hard as the clay beneath the topsoil. He stepped off the porch, and the evening, which had been so ordinary just a moment ago, shifted into something else entirely. Before continuing, comment below where you are watching from. Stories like this one begin in dust and silence, but they never end there. Earl Hadley was not a man who moved fast anymore. Time and loneliness in 11 Kansas summers without enough rain had worn the quickness out of him the way weather wears paint off a barn. He was 53 years old, lean in the way that men who forget to eat are lean, with hands so calloused they look like they belong to someone older. His hair had gone the color of winter wheat, pale and dry and thin at the temples. He walked with slight lean to the left, a gift from a tractor accident in 2009 that had never fully apologized for itself. But he crossed that field with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The sorghum grabbed at his boots as he pushed through the rows. The stalks were tall and brittle from the drought, and they made a sound like dry paper when he brushed against them. The sky was darkening fast, the way it does in August on the plains, not gradually but all at once, as if God reached up and turned a dial. By the time Earl reached the fence line, the first stars were already showing. He stopped at the post where the wire sagged lowest and looked out at the road. The man had stopped walking. He was standing maybe 40 yards up the road, and now Earl could see him clearly in the last gray light. He was older than Earl had first thought. Perhaps 60, heavy in the gut, wearing dirty work trousers and a short-sleeved shirt soaked through with sweat. His face was weathered and closed, the face of a man who had made peace with doing ugly things. He had a length of rope coiled on his belt. The girl's wrist was still in his grip, and now Earl could see her face. She was young. Lord, she was young. Dark eyes rimmed red from crying she was no longer doing. A bruise, fresh and purple as a plum, spreading beneath her left cheekbone. Her lips were pressed together so tightly they'd gone white. She was looking straight at Earl now, not with pleading, not with the theatrical desperation of someone performing distress, but with a flat, exhausted look of a person who has already been failed by enough people that they no longer expect much from the next one. That look hit Earl somewhere below the ribs. He'd seen it before. Once, in a different face, in a different life. Evening, Earl said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, roughed up by years of talking mostly to dogs and equipment. The big man turned. His eyes moved over Earl the way you measure a fence post. Briefly, dismissively. Keep walking, old-timer. Family matter. The girl flinched at the words family matter. Just barely. Just enough. Earl put one hand on the fence post. The wire bit into his palm, but he didn't move it. She don't look like she agrees with that assessment, he said. The man's jaw tightened. The rope on his belt swayed slightly in the hot evening wind. Behind him, half a mile up the road, Earl could see the weak yellow light of a truck parked on the shoulder, waiting, engine running, patient as a predator. Earl looked at the girl again, and she looked back at him with those worn-out eyes. And in the silence between two heartbeats, Earl Hadley made a decision that would unravel the careful, quiet, half-dead life he had been living, and remake it into something he hadn't dared imagine in 11 years. He lifted the wire and stepped through the fence. If you like stories from the countryside like this one, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. What happens next changes everything. The man didn't step back. Men like him never step back right away. That's the first thing they test. Whether the person walking toward them will slow down, will reconsider, will find some polite reason to stop and turn around and go back to their porch and their warm water and their quiet, uninvolved life. Earl didn't slow down. He walked up the road with his boots raising small ghosts of dust and his hands loose at his sides, and he kept his eyes on the big man's face the way his father had taught him to watch a bull. Not aggressive, not fearful, just present. Fully, completely present. I said it's a family matter. The man's voice had dropped into something lower now, a register meant to intimidate. Ain't none of your concern what happens between a man and his. I heard you, Earl said. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to see the sweat on the man's upper lip, close enough to smell the bourbon underneath the sweat. I'm talking to her. The man blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected. Earl turned to the girl. Up close she looked even younger, 19 at the most, maybe less. The bruise on her cheek was swelling now. Her dress was torn at the left shoulder. Her feet were cut from the road, thin lines of dried blood crossing the dust on her skin. You all right, miss? He asked. Simple, direct, the way you'd ask someone if they needed help lifting something heavy. She stared at him, her mouth opened slightly, like the question itself was foreign to her, like the ordinary human courtesy of it had caught her completely off guard. She don't need to answer you, the man said. She's got a mouth, Earl replied, without looking away from her. I'm asking her, not you. A long breath of hot wind moved down the road. The cottonwoods shivered. Somewhere in the dark field behind them a whippoorwill called once and went silent, as if it too was listening. The girl swallowed. Her free hand, the one not clamped in the man's fist, moved the tear at her shoulder and pulled the fabric together. A gesture so small and so dignified it made something ache in Earl's chest. My name is Celia, she said. Her voice was steady, remarkably steady. Celia Voss. Earl Hadley, he said. That's my land there. He nodded toward the sorghum field, without breaking eye contact with her. You're welcome on it any time you choose to be. The meaning was plain. The big man heard it clearly. Now you listen here. He let go of Celia's wrist and took one step toward Earl, and the shift in his posture was unmistakable. The kind of shift that precedes something physical, something meant to end a conversation fast and painfully. Earl didn't move, didn't raise his hands, didn't change his expression. What he did was reach slowly into the breast pocket of his work shirt and pull out a small, flat object that caught the last gray light of evening and held it. The man stopped, stared, and for the first time since Earl had come through that fence, something moved across the big man's face that wasn't contempt or calculation. It was uncertainty, because what Earl Hadley held in his hand wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a knife or a phone or anything the man had prepared himself for. It was something far more dangerous. And Celia Voss, standing in the dust of that Kansas road with blood on her feet and a bruise blooming on her face, looked at it and went completely still. It was a badge, not a sheriff's badge, not the kind you pin on a costume or buy at a roadside novelty store. It was a United States Marshal Service credential, worn at the edges, the leather of the billfold cracked from years of back pocket carry. The photograph inside it was younger than the man holding it, taken maybe 15 years ago, when Earl's hair was still more brown than pale, and his eyes hadn't yet acquired that particular quality of having seen too much and chosen to go quiet about it. He hadn't shown it to anyone in 4 years. Hadn't needed to. Hadn't wanted to. The man on the road read it twice. Earl could see his lips moving slightly. Then the man looked up, and whatever architecture of confidence had been holding his expression together quietly collapsed. "You're retired," Earl said. He folded the credential and put it back in his pocket with the same unhurried motion he'd used to take it out. "But retirement don't change what I know how to recognize." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "And it don't change who I know how to call." The big man's eyes cut the truck up the road. A reflex, involuntary. The kind of glance that tells you everything about where a person's courage actually lives. Earl followed his gaze, looked at the truck. "Look back. Whoever's in that cab," Earl said quietly. "They're going to want to think real carefully about the next 5 minutes." Silence. The whippoorwill had stopped calling entirely. Even the cicadas seemed to have pulled back, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The hot wind moved again, slow and purposeless, stirring the dust around their boots. Celia hadn't moved. She was watching Earl with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something between cautious hope and the practiced guardedness of someone who had learned that hope was a thing that cost you. The man on the road made his calculation. Earl could see it happening. The weighing, the measuring, the slow arithmetic of risk. Then something in the man's shoulders dropped, and he took 2 steps back. And without another word, he turned and walked up the road toward the truck with the stiff, contained gait of a man trying not to look like he was retreating. The truck's door opened. Closed. The engine, which had been idling, revved once, sharp and angry, like a final word. And then the headlights swung wide across the cottonwoods as it pulled a U-turn and moved away down the county road, taillights shrinking to 2 red points in the dark. Then nothing. Just the road. Just the dust. Just the sound of the land settling back into its nighttime rhythms. Earl turned to Celia. She was shaking, barely visible, but real, a fine tremor in her hands that she was trying to control and couldn't quite manage. The composure she had maintained through everything was beginning to crack now that the threat was gone, the way a wall sometimes waits until the storm passes before it falls. "Come on," Earl said. Same quiet voice. "My place isn't much, but it's dry and the well's cold." She looked at him, those dark, exhausted eyes measuring him with a precision born of necessity. "Why?" she asked, not suspiciously, almost philosophically, as if she genuinely wanted to understand the mechanics of someone choosing to help. Earl thought about that for a moment, looked out at his land, the dark rows of sorghum, the listing fence posts, the farmhouse with its single-lit window burning pale yellow against the black Kansas sky. "Because somebody should have done it sooner," he said. And Celia Voss, who had not cried through any of what just happened, who had held herself together with the kind of quiet iron that goes unrecognized because it wears a plain cotton dress and bare feet, pressed her lips together hard, and nodded, and followed him through the fence. Comment below, would you have had the courage to step through that fence? Tell me honestly. The farmhouse was exactly what it looked like from the road. Old, honest, tired in the way that things get tired when they've been useful for a long time, without much thanks. The porch boards flexed under their weight as they climbed the steps. The screen door had a tear in the lower corner that Earl had been meaning to fix for 2 summers. Inside, the kitchen smelled of coffee and dust and the faint ghost of smoke from a winter long past. Earl lit the overhead light. It was a bare bulb, and it threw everything into that particular sharp relief that bare bulbs do. No softness, no flattery, just the plain facts of a room. A wooden table with 3 chairs, One pushed permanently against a wall as if excused from service. A cast iron skillet on the stove. A calendar on the wall still turned to June because Earl had stopped bothering to change it. Celia stood just inside the door and looked at all of it, not with pity, not with judgment, with the careful, cataloging attention of someone who has learned to assess a space for safety before they allow themselves to rest inside it. Earl moved the sink and ran the cold tap, tore a length from a clean dish towel hanging on the oven handle. "Sit down," he said. "Let me see your feet." She sat. She was still shaking, finer now, almost imperceptible, but Earl had spent enough years reading people see it. He knelt on the kitchen floor, his knees protesting, as they always did, and without ceremony or awkwardness, he cleaned the cuts on her feet with the damp cloth. They weren't deep. Road cuts rarely were, but they needed attention, and nobody had been paying them any. She watched him do it. "You were really a Marshal?" she asked. 22 years, he said. "What happened?" He wrung out the cloth over the sink. Pink water spiraled down the drain. "Same thing that happens to most people who do that job long enough," he said. "You see enough of what people are capable of doing to each other, and one morning you wake up and you just—" He paused, found the right word. "Quiet down." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that why you live out here alone?" Earl looked up at her. In the bare bulb light, the bruise on her cheek had deepened to a dark plum color. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked simultaneously very young and very old, the way people look when life has asked too much of them too early. "Partly," he said. He stood, slowly. "You want to tell me who that man is?" The temperature in the room seemed to shift slightly. Celia's hands, resting on the table, moved together, fingers interlacing, pressing. "His name is Doyle Pritchard," she said. "He manages the Voss property, has for 12 years. A pause. "Voss is my grandfather's name, not mine by choice. I was placed with him by the state when I was 9. Earl pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't rush her. He'd learned, in 22 years of the work, that the most important information almost always arrives in the silence between sentences if you're patient enough to let it breathe. "My grandfather died 6 weeks ago," Celia continued. Her voice was even, practiced, the voice of someone who has rehearsed saying a thing many times in private before saying it aloud. "Left the property, 460 acres, a farmhouse, the equipment, 2 grain contracts, to me." She looked at Earl directly. "All of it? To me?" Earl said nothing. "Doyle Pritchard has been managing that land for 12 years, she said. He expected to inherit control of it. He had arrangements with certain people in town, certain people who had certain interests in how that land got used and who got to decide." She unclasped her hands, laid them flat on the table, a deliberate, steadying gesture. "I turned 21 last month," she said, "which means I can sign, which means the land is legally mine the moment I walk into the county recorder's office." Her dark eyes held Earl's without wavering. "Doyle was taking me somewhere I would not be able to walk into any office." The kitchen was very still. The refrigerator hummed. A moth tapped against the window screen. Outside, the Kansas night lay over everything like a dark and patient hand. Earl looked at this young woman sitting at his table, this young woman with cut feet and a bruised face and 460 acres and enemies who wore their cruelty like work clothes, casually, without apology, and he felt something move in him that had been still for a very long time. Not anger, something older than anger, something that had been the reason he'd taken the job in the first place, back when he was young and certain, and hadn't yet learned what certainty costs. He reached across the table and picked up the old rotary phone that had no business, still working in the 21st century. It worked. He dialed a number from memory, a number he hadn't dialed in 4 years. The line rang twice. A voice answered, and Earl Hadley, retired, quieted down, alone on purpose, said 7 words that set everything that followed into motion. "Leave a light to help the story reach more people. What Earl does next is something nobody in Harlan County will ever forget. The 7 words were simple. I need you to trust me again. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Deputy U.S. Marshal Sandra Reeves, out of the Wichita field office, a woman Earl had trained, had partnered with for 6 years, and had left without proper explanation on a Tuesday morning in October when he'd turned in credentials and driven west until the city disappeared in his rear-view mirror. She didn't hesitate, not for a single second. Tell me where you are, she said. What happened over the next 14 hours was the kind of thing that doesn't make the evening news in cities, but spreads through small counties like weather, quietly, completely, leaving everything changed. Sandra arrived before dawn with 2 deputies and a county prosecutor named Webb, who had apparently been building a case against Doyle Pritchard for 18 months without enough to move on. The truck that had driven away from Earl's fence line that night was registered to a man named Carl Briggs, a county commissioner with land interests in 3 adjacent properties, all of which shared borders with the Voss estate. The rope on Pritchard's belt was consistent with restraint. The bruise on Celia's face was photographed and documented. 2 witnesses emerged from the town of Grover, 12 miles east, who had seen things over the years and had been waiting, as witnesses in small towns often wait, for someone with enough authority to make their coming forward feel safe rather than suicidal. Doyle Pritchard was arrested at 6:17 in the morning at a motel outside of Coldwater. Carl Briggs turned himself in by noon, accompanied by a lawyer who kept straightening his tie. Celia Voss walked into the Harlan County Recorder's office at 2:15 in the afternoon, wearing a clean blouse that Sandra Reeves had thought to bring, with the bruise on her cheek still dark and visible and her chin level and her eyes clear. She signed her name. 460 acres. Hers. Earl wasn't there for the signing. He'd stayed at the farm. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And besides, that moment belonged to Celia alone. He didn't need to witness it to know what it meant. He could feel it somehow, out in the sorghum field where he was walking the rows in the afternoon heat, checking the stalks of the drought damage he already knew was there. The land was dry. It had been dry for 2 years. The sorghum was thin, and the yield would be poor, and the winter would require careful accounting. These were the facts. They did not change, but the air felt different. He couldn't explain it. A man of 53 with calloused hands and a bad knee and 11 years of deliberate solitude wasn't supposed to put stock in the way air feels. And yet, the sky that afternoon was enormous and blue and absolutely clear, the kind of Kansas sky that makes you understand why people who grew up under it can never quite feel comfortable under city ceilings. The heat pressed down, honest and indifferent. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the east field. The cottonwoods along the fence line moved in a long, slow wave, like something breathing. He heard the car come up his drive around 4 o'clock. He walked in from the field, pulling off his gloves, and found Celia standing beside Sandra's government sedan. Sandra was leaning against the hood with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that Earl recognized. The look she used to get when a case closed the right way, which was not always, which was why the look was worth something when it appeared. Celia was holding a manila envelope. She walked toward him across the yard, and the dust rose around her feet now properly bandaged, wearing borrowed boots a size too large, and she stopped a few feet away and looked at it with those dark eyes that had already seen too much and were now, cautiously, beginning to look at something else. "It's done," she said. Earl nodded. "Good." She held out the envelope. "There are papers in here that need a witness signature. A neighbor. Someone with legal standing in the county." A pause. The ghost of something that might become a smile moved across her face. "Turns out retired U.S. Marshals qualify." He took the envelope, looked at it, looked at her. "You have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked. She glanced back at the road, at the flat, enormous, indifferent land stretching in every direction under the wide Kansas sky. "I have 460 acres, she said. "The farmhouse needs work." Pritchard let things go. She paused. "Everything needs work." "Most things worth having do," Earl said. Sandra, from her position against the car hood, made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a laugh. Earl ignored her. He looked out at his sorghum, thin, dry, honest, and then at the horizon where the sun was beginning its evening descent, pulling the sky from blue into that deep amber that belonged only to this place, this flat and ancient and enduring ground. 11 years he had been quiet here. 11 years of warm water and empty chairs and calendars. He didn't bother to turn. He thought about the moment he had almost not looked up from his porch. How close it had come to that. How the entire weight of what followed had balanced on one small, ordinary, nearly missed movement of his eyes. He thought about Margaret and about the job, and about all the roads that had led him to a cracked chair on a tired porch on an August evening in Kansas. And he thought that maybe, the roads hadn't been leading him away from something after all. Maybe they'd been leading him here, to this exact fence post, this exact moment. This young woman with borrowed boots and 460 acres and a bruise that would fade, as bruises do, and dark eyes that were slowly, carefully beginning to open back up to the world. He signed the papers on the hood of Sandra's car, using her pen. Then he looked at Celia. "You know anything about sorghum?" he asked. She blinked. "No." "Good," he said. "Neither do I anymore. We'll figure out." And Sandra Reeves, who had driven 3 hours before dawn for a man who'd left without explanation and called after 4 years of silence, watched the two of them walk toward the farmhouse in the long golden light of a Kansas evening. The retired marshal and the young woman who had refused to stop, standing even when the ground was cut and the road was dust and no one was coming. She watched until the screen door closed behind them. Then she got in her car, and she smiled the whole way back to Wichita. Some people walk through life waiting for someone to step through the fence for them. Earl had been waiting too. He just didn't know it yet. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And comment below where you're watching from, because this story just traveled all the way from a Kansas dirt road to find you. The land endures. And so, do the people who refuse to look away.